Hey guys, Sean from Craft Developments. We are the company that has been making large format silicone and HDPE molds for resin artists and woodworkers since 2019. Today I'm actually be working on a project that doesn't involve a mold at all, but is definitely resin oriented, and it's going to be a unique one because here in our warehouse we have a few of these copper tabletops left over. Long story short, we've had a few different businesses in the past, and including an import-export business where we imported like high-end sinks, faucets, furniture, tabletops. So these are actually from Mexico. This is hand-hammered copper, basically draped over a plywood core. But it is very thick. I think it's like 16 or 18 gauge. I think it's 16 gauge copper. It's very thick, and these are pretty expensive. However, they've been sitting here in our warehouse, and I'm looking for a project to kind of use them in. So today I'm actually going to be applying an ocean beach art scene right over this tabletop using none other than Just Crow and TotalBoat's Maker Epoxy. Maker Epoxy is a great product for this particular use because it's very much an art resin or like a coating resin. It's very, very thick. It's good for, you know, quarter inch up to like a quarter inch coats. So if you're doing art like this, you want to make an ocean scene or you know, cover an entire table or countertop, this stuff's perfect because it's thick. It won't run everywhere like a very, very deep pore resin is very, very watery. It'll just kind of disperse everywhere. So this is a good product to do art type applications like this. I highly recommend Maker Epoxy and the entire TotalBoat line of resin products. So this is a little bit different, as I said, because it is copper. This table is actually pre-polished and sealed. So the very first thing I'm going to do to this top is I'm going to choose where we want our ocean slash beach slash waves to be, and I'm going to give it a light sand, and then I'm going to coat it with a pre-tinted blue primer that we're going to tint here, and then we're going to start on the resin aspect of the project, and we'll see how it turns out. Got my sander hooked up, 120 grit papers on there, and I'm just going to create kind of a random organic wave here, and I put the mask on because in case any of this polish comes off into the air, I don't want to breathe that in. So let's go. Is I'm going to pre-primer the area that we want the ocean in. So we don't need a lot of primer. And I'm also going to tint this primer in a dark blue. The reason I'm primering it is because this is a very dark surface. Obviously, as you can tell, it's like a dark Jacobine or a dark brown color. If we use just blue resin, unless it's super thick pigment and very blue, you're going to see right through into the brown. And we definitely want to see more blue on the ocean side than brown. The brown we're leaving for the sand side, which is why we're going to pre-primer it with essentially a blue primer. And to make that, all we're going to do is use some of our blue pigment, probably the same stuff that we're going to use to make the to mix up the resin. So we've ended up with kind of a greenish blue color, which is just fine. The key is it needs to be light. We don't want to have the dark brown underneath the resin. At least this way with an ocean, there's greens and there's blues, and it'll kind of make sense. And I'm simply going to take our primer, and this is a water-based primer, and I'm going to kind of follow the line. Hard to see in the video, but the general line where I sanded, which is going to be the outline of our water portion of the ocean and beach scene. Now, of course, I'm doing this because of this material. It is a shiny metal which has been polished, so that's why I sanded it, and now I'm primering it. However, if you're using a light wood like a maple or even a walnut, you probably wouldn't have to do this, or you most definitely wouldn't have to do this. You would just apply resin right on there. But again, this is just the effect I'm going for. And you also don't need perfect coverage, just needs to be good enough. And you wouldn't also, you definitely don't want to have a straight, perfect line at the seam here. A nice fade or a feather is probably more ideal than a straight line, which looks inorganic. And the great thing is, you know, you can do this with any sort of pre-existing countertop or tabletop. You can even do this with a laminate top as long as you've pre-primered the laminate first. You'll see a lot of companies offering epoxy countertops where they literally just pour epoxy. I mean, they treat, but then they pour epoxy over, you know, old laminate countertops to essentially refresh kitchens and bathrooms. So it's kind of the same process. And there's actually specific primer for doing epoxy over laminate tops. All right. All right, this primer base is almost dry. This is a pretty quick dry primer, so you can see it's, you know, there's nothing really left there. Almost dry, but in the meantime, we can mix up our epoxy resin. And again, we're using the Mega Epoxy product by Just Crow and TotalBoat. Because this is a tabletop covering application. It's an art application, so it's going to be a thin layer. It's going to be thick, and it's going to dry within 24 hours or so, within 24 hours. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix up this entire rest of this batch that I have. It is a 1-to-1 ratio. You could obviously do less if it was smaller top, but you know, I don't exactly know how much I'm going to end up using here because we're going to do it in 2 or 3 different layers and different colors. But we're going to mix it all at once and then separate it out and tint them all separately. So let's get started on that. Now, just so I can talk and work at the same time, I've turned on my big fan and I've opened up our warehouse door. And I've taken my mask off so I can talk, but obviously, usually when you're working with resins, particularly urethane resins, not as much epoxies, but either way, you'll probably want to wear proper PPE. So you're going to want to stir your resin really, really well, and if you can see on camera, stuff is extremely thick. Whereas if you've ever used a casting resin, like a deep pour resin, you know, for making things that are 1, 2, 3 inches thick, it's very, very watery. Takes a long time to set, but it also allows the bubbles to come out really easily. Whereas this is, again, an art resin or a tabletop coating resin, which is obviously very, very thick for that reason. Next thing we're going to do is separate this into a few different containers. And we're doing that because we obviously want to have different colors. If you look at a regular ocean and beach, you see that the farther into the ocean, further off the beach, is a darker blue, maybe even a dark green. And then as you get closer, you know, in the tropical environments, it goes to like a turquoise or like a bright kind of a teal blue. So we kind of do the same thing with layering, but we also want to keep a fair amount of clear for our waves. And I will show you how we're going to do that soon. All right, so when it comes to pigments, you have pearl pigments, which contain mica. They're like a powdered pigment. And then you've also got like alcohol-based pigments, something like this from TotalBoat. Actually, you know what? I don't actually know if they're alcohol-based pigments, but they are liquid pigments where they don't create a pearl effect. They're more like a solid or an opaque solid color effect, which would be helpful white when we're doing waves. And then you've got things like these, which are alcohol-based pigments. There's the smooth-on tint, the Illuminate white, and they're a liquid pigment again. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from a dark bluish green to a light blue, and then we're going to do our clear and our waves. So it's kind of up to you as the artist to determine, and of course what you have in your arsenal there, what type of blue you want to go with. So I'm going to use a Pinata alcohol pigment called Baja Blue. And I'm also going to mix some lighter blue as well. And if you want to make a darker blue, then you can, mix pigment. You can see I'm doing this, but I'm also going to add a little bit of black. Is this black? Yeah, black to this one, just to create a darker blue. You see we've got a definite dark blue forming here, a really nice color. And there's almost a little bit of green in there, you can see. And then this will be our lighter blue. And how much pigment you add also will determine how transparent the resin is. And again, one of the reasons why we pre-tinted the primer before we put it on the tabletop is to make sure that we have, if it is really transparent, we don't see, the brown tabletop underneath it kind of ruining our blue or green effect. It's got a nice light blue, a little bit of transparency there. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment because I don't want it that transparent. All right, next thing I'm going to do is pour our white just to have that ready. We're not going to need a heck of a lot of it. And that's going to be very, very, very heavily pigmented in white because we are going to want to use this to create our laced waves. There's a lot of different whites out there, a lot of different products for doing this lacing. I'm not really an ocean artist, so I just have a generic Alumilite pigment there. But there are a lot of whites and a lot of pigments specifically for doing waves. All right, so we're about ready to start laying down our resin. Again, our primer's dry, and we're going to go from the deepest point of the ocean to the beach. So at the deepest point, we're going to have our darkest blue. You can see there. And I've got my gloves on because I'm going to have to work this into the sides. And I'm kind of going with the shape of the primer that I laid down. I'm going to go ahead and lay our lighter blue down in the next layer. And then I'm going to start working this in to make sure that we get good coverage along the sides, because the last thing you want is a kind of a bald spot along the edge. And that's why I like using the gloves instead of like a tool to do this, because it is much easier to use your hands and get dirty and really work it in, especially with something like this where it's a hammered copper. It's very, very textured, right? So it's a heck of a lot harder to get into all that area. Then I'm going to take our lighter color and go almost up to the primer line, making it in that way. And all here, I'm going to kind of do this and just get some intermingling so it's not such a straight line. As the resin sets, it'll blend a little bit better. The great thing about using, epoxy is that, say you don't like this color. Well, you go mix some more blue, a darker blue, and you lay it down and get rid of the rest, right? You can kind of take it as you go, just like any other art form. This is not set in stone, especially as you're making it. All right, now at our interface here, where the ocean meets the sand, we're going to take our clear and lay down in this case, about an inch wide section of just clear epoxy. And then what that does is it creates a barrier. It also creates something for us to set our white resin into, which we can then blow out with the heat gun to make waves. All right, got that done, and then we're going to take our heavily pigmented white and go right along the edge. Just going to fill that in a little bit more. You have no gaps in that clear line. And this you want to be a little bit careful with, because if you mix white anywhere else, you're going to end up with a ruined project. You want to keep the white right along the edge there. Perfect. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take my gloves off, and then I'm going to grab our heat gun. All right, so I've got my heat gun. There's a lot of different people that use, will recommend different heat guns. This part you definitely want to use PPE for. So I'm going to kind of vanish from the audio here while I do this, because you're heating up resin and blowing it and all that kind of stuff, so you don't want to be inhaling this. But essentially what we're doing, we're taking our heat gun, and we're blowing from the beach to the ocean. Essentially, this is going to be the cap of the wave, the very, very front of the wave, and then everything else is going outwards. And there's also attachments you can get for these heat guns that narrow down the blowing area to create more of a concentrated force of air, and those are definitely better for doing this type of wave work, because it gets more force and blows the waves out a little bit further to get kind of a cooler effect. This is a so-so heat gun, but it will do the job. This effect that you're seeing, which is the creation of these cells called lacing, and this is really only going to happen with a liquid pigment. If you're using like a white mica pigment, like the stuff we use it here, like a blue mica pigment, but if it was white, you wouldn't get this lacing effect. You'd end up just with a kind of a white line that was all mixed together. So to get that cool lacing, the wave-like effect, you definitely want to use like a white alcohol-based pigment. Now what I'm going to do, I think that turned out really nice, but I'm going to put a lighter wave down here. So I'm going to come back, do a little bit of clear resin, pour the white, and then lace it again. All right, folks, that's pretty much it. The very last thing I'm going to want to do is I'm actually going to come and cover the rest of this table with clear epoxy. And that the entire point of that is really just to make this all generally level, so you don't have a ridge here. You can certainly leave it, a lot of people do. You could also let this set and then come back and do another clear line of resin with some white and have another layer of waves on top for even more depth. But I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Once I get the rest of the clear on there, and I really just have to let it set and it'll be done. The very last thing I'm going to do here is make sure that these two seams come together. And I'm just going to heat up the resin to make it a little bit more free-flowing, and that way we end up with a flat surface, a flat transition there. And of course, if there's any bubbles or any areas that are not taking the resin very well, we'll quickly hit them with a torch and that'll get rid of that problem. Perfect. Again, we didn't have to do that extra layer of clear, but I wanted to keep the level all the same instead of having a ridge, because if you are using this as, for example, like a desk and you're writing on it or you're putting your computer on it, you don't want to have an unlevel surface. So I really like having a nice level surface, and the Maker Epoxy by TotalBoat is self-leveling, which is amazing. It just gives you a really nice glossy level surface, and this thing's going to look amazing once it's actually set. I want to thank TotalBoat for sending us that Maker Epoxy to do this project. And if you're looking to get some of your own TotalBoat product, you can go to TotalBoat.com. They have their entire line of both the Maker Epoxy by Just Crow, as well as their thick set deep pours and their super thick set Fathom, which is even deeper pour for doing things like casting, river tables, and things like that. Now that our resin is completely set and dry on the other side, I flipped the table over, put it on a nice soft cloth so the surface doesn't get all scratched up. And then all these drip marks I'm just going to sand off. I've seen some people, and actually what I do often is I'll put painter's tape around the edge before pouring, and then when I do this I use a heat gun and just pull the tape up, and it just kind of takes all these ridges right off. I just neglected to do that this time. I don't know why, I guess I was in a hurry, but the sanding method works just as well. Wear a mask. I've got my fans on, I've got my door open just so I can talk to you and do this at the same time. But I'm just going to take an 80 grit and I'll probably go to like a 120. Because it's underside of the table, you're not going to see it, so it's the visual aspect doesn't really matter that much. All right, the very last thing to do to finish this tabletop is, of course, to give the table some legs. So we're going to set this up as a coffee table, so I've just ordered on Amazon some 16-inch hairpin legs. And there are a lot of different options. This could easily be a desk if you put in taller legs. These are 16-inch hairpin legs that we're going to attach on all corners. Well, that completes this project. I hope you enjoyed following along here on YouTube. For other resin projects, including how we use our big silicone and HDP maker molds, make sure you follow us here on our YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe and notify button. If you have any questions, make sure you comment below. Thanks for watching.